Okay, well, what about safety? How do large reactors do on safety? Now, this is a bit of a more complicated, but a pretty interesting story. It was assumed that, well, let's go to basics. The basics are that, these reactors have a core of material in it that gets very, very hot, uranium, essentially. And that core reacts and neutrons fly around, fissioning's occurring, and heat's being released. And it almost always is being cooled by some form of water, more often than not, in the most popular models. And safety requires that the reactor and the spent fuel ponds, because after they get done with the fuel in that reactor core, they put it in a pond to cool outside of the reactor containment building generally. In both cases, you've got to keep coolant running over the fuel. Why? If you don't, it'll heat up, and when it heats up, it will melt in such a fashion that it'll do two things. It'll produce gases in conjunction with the heat that it produces and the reactions that heat produces with the cladding, which is frequently made of a material called zirconium. And when it does, it releases hydrogen, which is kind of explosive. And we'll show you some pictures of those explosions. But in addition, the fuel itself can get so hot it melts, and it can go through not only the fuel cladding, which is zirconium, but if you get a really, really bad core meltdown, it can actually melt through the core vessel. And some of you may have heard of a movie with Jane Fonda called China Syndrome. Well, that's a reference to melting not only through the reactor vessel, but all the way down through the ground to China. Now that's a joke, but the point is that if it breaks through the containment, you're going to have a radiological release. And if it produces hydrogen, you can have explosions. This is all very bad because the radiation can hurt people in a permanent fashion. So reactors originally used a big, heavy concrete structures called containment buildings as a key line of defense against all of the risks I just described. The way in which, of course, you would have these accidents again is the loss of coolant. But what happened in the mid-60s, and I got this from Victor Galinsky, who was someone who I refer to as my mentor. He's on the commission. He worked with Peter. What happened in the mid-60s is the Atomic Energy Commission staff figured out that they wanted to build reactors larger to take advantage of economies of scale, because they wanted to make the price of electricity per dollar invested in building the reactor less. Well, they said, well, the reactors are going to grow several fold in size, and the cost of building a containment building over the entire reactor, it'd be off the scale. So we got to come up with an argument for why maybe we don't need to have a containment building that takes care of all of the problems of core meltdown, fuel meltdown, and loss of coolant accidents. And what they came up with is, well, if we have enough cooling and emergency cooling systems, we can probably say that a core meltdown and a fuel failure of any significance would be virtually impossible. And therefore, we don't really have to worry so much about hydrogen releases, because they only happen if you have fuel failures that are really intense. And the containment building would only have to worry about the release of some steam or coolant. It wouldn't have to deal with all the pressures that would occur if you had a big hydrogen release or a core meltdown. Okay, let's take a look at the next chart before we go back to these other. Here is an explanation of this that's more visual. The Hallam plant was constructed in, I want to say, 62. It ran for 2 years. It was a pretty exotic plant. It was cooled with sodium. But you'll notice that the whole plant was encased with a structure all over it, if you will, all the components. That was not what persisted. That plant was only, I think, the size of that was 240 megawatts electrical. As plants got to the size of 800 and larger megawatts electrical, they went to this more relaxed containment requirement. Well, what was that about? Take a look at this schematic on the left. You'll notice that at the top, all the way at the top, if you can go up and then come down, you'll see there's a sprinkler system right underneath the dome. Come into the dome. Do you see the sprinkler system? There you go, that thing. Well, that's water. And that's supposed to come on if there's any kind of release of steam, you know, from the either the steam generator or the core. Also, they had an ice system that would release, you know, ice and cool things down. If you can cool things down in the containment building, the pressures become manageable. And you don't need to make the containment building to high PSI ratings. And you can make it smaller, okay? And if you'll notice at the 3 Mile Island facility, instead of enclosing everything, the containment, you know, covered most of the nuclear island, and it didn't have to be as reinforced as it might have otherwise had to be, because the cooling was going to take care of the probability of core meltdown and the meltdown of the fuel. And so that was, you know, considered virtually impossible. And they thought they could save money this way.